Late 1814. America's capital is ashes, its army is deserting, its treasury is empty, and the world's strongest empire is closing in. By all logic, the United States should not exist today. In the final stretch of the War of 1812, the United States existed in a state of quiet panic. Even its official language tried to hide it. The nation was barely 3 decades old, still experimenting with what it meant to govern itself. And suddenly, it was facing the full pressure of the world's most powerful empire. What had begun as a controversial war over trade, sovereignty, and honor had transformed into a struggle for national survival. By late 1814, nearly every weakness of the young republic had been exposed at once. The economy was exhausted, the government divided, the military stretched thin, and public confidence dangerously low. Independence, which many had assumed was permanent after the Revolution, now felt uncertain and fragile. The burning of Washington was the moment when fear stopped being theoretical. When British troops marched into the Capitol and set fire to the White House, the Capitol, and other government buildings, it sent a shockwave through the country. This was not a distant battlefield loss or a rumor carried by slow newspapers. It was visible proof that the nation could be humiliated, invaded, and struck at its core. For citizens across the states, the image of their capital in ashes shattered the belief that America was protected by geography or destiny. If the seat of government could fall, then no city, no town, and no community was truly safe. At the same time, British power was reaching its peak. With Napoleon defeated in Europe, Britain no longer needed to divide its attention. Veteran soldiers, hardened by years of brutal warfare, were now free to be deployed across the Atlantic. These were not inexperienced troops fighting a former colony. They were professionals who had faced Europe's greatest armies and survived. Their arrival changed the balance of the war overnight. American forces, many of them militia with limited training and inconsistent discipline, suddenly faced opponents who were better equipped, better led, and far more experienced. The psychological gap between the two sides widened just as resources and morale inside the United States were collapsing. The financial situation alone threatened to end the war, regardless of military outcomes. The federal government was running out of money, unable to raise sufficient taxes or secure reliable loans. Banks had suspended payments in hard currency, credit was unstable, and inflation eroded what little economic confidence remained. Soldiers went unpaid, suppliers hesitated to deliver goods, and basic logistics became a daily struggle. War is not sustained by courage alone, and by this point, the machinery that kept the American war effort alive was barely functioning. Every month, the conflict continued increased the risk that the system would simply fail under its own weight. Political unity, already fragile before the war, was close to breaking. Opposition to the conflict was strongest in New England, where trade had been devastated by British blockades. Merchants saw their livelihoods disappear, ports stood idle, and resentment toward the federal government intensified. Some Federalist leaders openly questioned whether the war was justified at all, while others went further, hinting that separation from the Union might be preferable to continued sacrifice. The Hartford Convention, whether exaggerated by rumor or not, symbolized a dangerous reality. Parts of the country were no longer fully committed to fighting as one nation. In a moment of extreme external pressure, internal division became one of America's greatest vulnerabilities. Militarily, the United States had little room for error left. Early optimism had faded after failed invasions of Canada and inconsistent battlefield results. While there had been moments of naval success earlier in the war, Britain's overwhelming fleet eventually imposed a blockade that choked American trade and isolated coastal regions. Supplies became harder to move, communication slowed, and strategic coordination weakened. Coastal towns lived under constant threat of attack, knowing British ships could appear without warning. Each raid, each skirmish, reinforced the sense that the nation was reacting to events rather than controlling them. Leadership during this period faced impossible choices. President Madison and his administration were criticized from all sides, blamed for starting a war the country seemed unprepared to finish. Commanders disagreed on strategy, militias resisted federal authority, and coordination between states often depended on personal relationships rather than clear command structures. The United States lacked the centralized military organization needed for a sustained, large-scale conflict. Instead, it relied on a patchwork of forces, each with its own priorities and limitations. In such an environment, even small mistakes could have irreversible consequences. Internationally, the United States stood isolated. No major power rushed to its defense, and diplomatic leverage was limited. European nations watched cautiously, aware that a British victory could redraw the political map of North America. If the United States collapsed or was forced into unfavorable peace terms, it would serve as a warning to other revolutionary movements around the world. The American experiment was not just a national issue. It was a global test of whether a republic could survive against imperial power. Failure would have echoed far beyond its borders. What made this moment especially dangerous was not a single catastrophic defeat, but the convergence of crises. Economic collapse, political division, military pressure, and psychological fear were all advancing at the same time. There was no clear solution, no obvious path to victory. Survival depended on holding together just long enough for circumstances to change, yet no one could say when or how that change would come. For ordinary citizens, the war had ceased to be an abstract debate about rights and policy. It became a daily anxiety about safety, stability, and the future of the country itself. Yet even in this atmosphere of near despair, the nation did not simply unravel. Communities continued to organize defenses, farmers supplied what they could, and soldiers remained in the field despite exhaustion and uncertainty. Motivation no longer came from promises of glory or expansion, but from a quieter determination to protect homes, families, and the idea that independence should not end in humiliation. This persistence was uneven and imperfect, but it mattered. Each week, the country survived without collapsing bought time, and time was the one resource Britain could not fully control. Rumors spread constantly, often worsening fear. Stories of overwhelming British armies, secret negotiations, and impending betrayals circulated faster than reliable news. In an age of slow communication, uncertainty became its own enemy. Decisions were made with incomplete information, and confidence was fragile. Still, the basic structure of the Republic held. Courts functioned, elections continued, and civilian government remained in place. These details, often overlooked, were crucial. Collapse does not usually announce itself with a single dramatic moment. It begins when systems quietly stop working. In late 1814, America's systems were strained, but they had not yet failed. The war also forced Americans to confront uncomfortable truths about their nation. The idea that independence guaranteed security was shattered. The belief that virtue alone could replace preparation was exposed as dangerous. The United States learned painfully that ideals without strength were vulnerable, and that unity could not be assumed in moments of crisis. These lessons came at enormous cost, but they shaped how the country understood itself moving forward. As the final months unfolded, the future remained deeply uncertain. Peace negotiations had begun, but their outcome was unknown, and fighting continued as if no talks existed at all. A single decisive British victory could still tip the balance, forcing humiliating concessions or even threatening the nation's existence. Americans lived with the knowledge that survival depended on events beyond their control, yet also on their ability to endure pressure without breaking apart. This was the reality of the first part of America's near collapse, not a dramatic end, but a prolonged moment of vulnerability where failure felt plausible every day. The nation stood exposed, imperfect, and divided, facing an empire at the height of its power. Independence was no longer a historical fact. It was an open question, And as 1814 drew to a close, the answer to that question had not yet been decided. As the crisis deepened, the reality facing the United States grew darker with each passing week. The British Empire was no longer fighting a distant colonial rebellion, but a weakened nation struggling to defend its own existence. With Napoleon defeated, Britain redirected veteran troops, powerful fleets, and experienced commanders toward North America. This shift changed everything. What had once been a secondary conflict suddenly became a focused campaign, and the imbalance of power was impossible to ignore. American forces were scattered, undertrained, and poorly supplied, while British soldiers arrived disciplined, battle-hardened, and confident from years of European warfare. The psychological impact alone was devastating, as rumors spread that Britain intended not just to punish, but to permanently break the American experiment. Inside the United States, the situation was equally fragile. The federal government was nearly bankrupt, struggling to fund the army, maintain supply lines, or even pay its soldiers on time. Banks had suspended specie payments, credit was collapsing, and inflation eroded what little stability remained. Farmers, merchants, and workers all felt the strain, and support for the war weakened as hardship intensified. In New England, opposition reached dangerous levels. Some Federalist leaders openly criticized the war, questioned the legitimacy of the government's decisions, and even hinted at separation. The idea that the nation could fracture from within no longer felt unthinkable, it felt possible. Military setbacks reinforced this sense of impending collapse. American attempts to invade Canada had largely failed, costing lives without delivering decisive victories. On the seas, early naval successes had faded as the British tightened their blockade, strangling American trade and cutting off vital supplies. Coastal towns lived in constant fear of attack, knowing that British ships could appear at any moment. The burning of Washington was more than a tactical loss. It was a symbolic shock that shattered the illusion of security. If the capital could fall so easily, many wondered what could truly be defended. Leadership faced enormous pressure, and mistakes carried consequences that could not be undone. Commanders disagreed on strategy, militias resisted federal control, and coordination between states remained weak. The United States had no unified war machine, only a loose collection of forces trying to act as one. Every delay favored Britain, every misstep magnified the imbalance. The margin for error shrank to almost nothing, and each decision seemed to carry the weight of national survival. Internationally, the young republic stood alone. No major power rushed to its aid, and diplomatic leverage was limited. European nations watched carefully, calculating whether the United States would endure or fade back into the shadow of empire. A decisive British victory could have reshaped the continent, altering borders, alliances, and the future balance of power. The possibility that the United States might lose territory, independence, or credibility was no longer abstract. It hovered over every negotiation, every battle, every political debate. Yet within this atmosphere of fear and uncertainty, resistance did not disappear. Ordinary citizens, despite exhaustion and doubt, continued to defend their towns, farms, and families. Soldiers who had little pay and fewer supplies still stood their ground, driven by something deeper than strategy or politics. For many, the war had become personal. It was no longer about trade rights or national honor, but about whether the sacrifices of the revolution had meant anything at all. This quiet determination prevented total collapse, even as the nation trembled. As the war dragged on, both sides edged toward a decisive turning point. Peace talks began in Europe, but their outcome was uncertain, and the fighting continued with relentless intensity. Time itself became a weapon. If Britain could force a crushing blow before negotiations concluded, the United States would have little leverage left. If America could survive just long enough, the very act of endurance might preserve its future. Everything depended on moments yet to come, moments that would decide whether the Republic would break under pressure or emerge scarred but alive. By this stage, the United States was not fighting from a position of strength, but from the brink. Collapse was not guaranteed, but it was close enough to be felt in every empty treasury, every divided council, and every battlefield where defeat seemed one step away. History often remembers survival as inevitable, but at that moment, nothing was certain. The nation's fate rested on fragile foundations, balanced between failure and endurance, waiting for events that would determine whether America would disappear from history or continue its unfinished experiment. As the war entered its final phase, the struggle narrowed to a few decisive theaters, where the future of the United States would be settled. British strategy now focused on delivering a crushing blow that would leave no doubt about the outcome. In the north, a powerful British force advanced from Canada toward New York, aiming to cut off New England from the rest of the country. Control of this corridor would not only cripple American logistics, but also strengthen separatist sentiment in regions already hostile to the war. The campaign moved toward Lake Champlain, where land and naval power would collide in a moment that could determine whether the nation remained whole or fractured beyond repair. The American position was desperate. Supplies were scarce, reinforcements unreliable, and morale fragile. Yet commanders understood that retreat was not an option. If the British succeeded here, peace negotiations would occur under humiliation, not leverage. Against overwhelming odds, American forces prepared to resist, knowing that delay itself could change history. When the confrontation finally came, it unfolded with stunning intensity. On the water, American naval forces fought with precision and resolve, denying the British control of the lake. On land, outnumbered troops held their positions just long enough to prevent a decisive breakthrough. The British advance stalled, not because they lacked power, but because time had slipped through their grasp. This moment quietly altered the balance of the war. While the northern front held, attention shifted southward, where Britain sought a victory so dramatic it would erase all previous setbacks. New Orleans became the focal point. The city was strategically vital, controlling access to the Mississippi River and the vast interior of the continent. Its fall would have strangled American trade and shattered any claim to Western expansion. British commanders believed the city was vulnerable and expected a swift victory. What they encountered instead was a fiercely improvised defense led by determined forces who understood exactly what was at stake. The defenders of New Orleans were a mixture of regular soldiers, militia, frontiersmen, and local volunteers. They lacked the polish of European armies, but they possessed intimate knowledge of the terrain and a relentless will to survive. Hastily constructed fortifications, swampy ground, and disciplined marksmanship transformed the battlefield into a deadly trap. When the British assault began, it met a wall of resistance far stronger than anticipated. Wave after wave of troops advanced, only to be cut down by coordinated fire. Confusion spread through British ranks as commanders fell and momentum collapsed. What was meant to be a decisive victory became a catastrophic defeat. The significance of this battle extended far beyond the field itself. Although peace negotiations were already underway in Europe, news traveled slowly. Neither side knew the outcome when the fighting occurred. Had the British won at New Orleans, they would have entered negotiations from a position of dominance, able to demand territory, concessions, and perhaps even limits on American sovereignty. Instead, the unexpected American victory reshaped perceptions overnight. It sent a powerful signal that the United States could defend itself even against the strongest empire in the world. When the Treaty of Ghent was finalized, it reflected this fragile balance. No territory changed hands. No clear victor was declared. On paper, it appeared as a return to the status quo. In reality, it marked survival. The United States had endured invasion, internal division, economic collapse, and near military defeat, yet emerged intact. Independence was preserved not through overwhelming strength, but through resilience, timing, and a refusal to collapse when failure seemed inevitable. The aftermath revealed just how close the nation had come to disappearing. Had any one of several moments turned out differently, the northern invasion succeeding, New Orleans falling, internal opposition escalating, the outcome could have been fatal. The Republic survived not because history favored it, but because it endured long enough for circumstances to shift. This reality challenges the idea that America's rise was guaranteed. In its early years, survival was uncertain, fragile, and deeply contested. The war left lasting scars. Cities lay damaged, trade networks disrupted, and political divisions unresolved. Yet, it also forged a new sense of identity. Americans no longer saw independence as an inherited achievement from the Revolution, but as something defended and preserved under extreme pressure. The conflict exposed weaknesses, but it also proved that the nation could withstand crisis without collapsing into chaos or submission. In the years that followed, the memory of near defeat shaped policy, defense, and national consciousness. Leaders understood the cost of unpreparedness. Citizens remembered how close everything had come to ending. The idea of unity, though imperfect, gained new importance, forged not by triumph but by survival. The United States had not won a glorious victory, it had escaped annihilation. History often compresses these moments into neat conclusions, but lived reality was far messier. Fear, doubt, and exhaustion were constant companions. Decisions were made without certainty, often under unbearable pressure. That the nation survived at all was not a simple outcome, but a narrow passage through chaos. Collapse was not a distant threat, it was a daily possibility. In the end, America did not emerge stronger because it was invincible. It emerged because, when everything went wrong at once, it did not break completely. The War of 1812 closed with no dramatic conquest, no sweeping declaration of victory, but with something far more fragile and significant: continued existence. The United States remained on the map, not as a proven power, but as a nation that had faced the edge of collapse and stepped back just in time. In the end, the most dangerous moment in American history was not marked by a single battle or a single decision, but by how close everything came to falling apart at once. The nation survived not because it was ready, united, or strong, but because it refused to disappear when history gave it every reason to fail. Collapse was not avoided by dominance, but by endurance. The War of 1812 proved that survival itself can be a victory, and that nations, like people, are often defined not by how they rise, but by how they endure their darkest hour. America remained standing not because its future was guaranteed, but because, in the final seconds, it chose not to fall.